Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is Ray Padgett. He's going to share some stories about Tom Waits.
Yeah, one of my favorite Tom Waits songs is the song called Black Wings, and it is off of one of his early 90s albums, an album called Bone Machine. And one part I loved, I always loved it, is it has this amazing guitar solo. Just this weird, haunted guitar solo that it ends, you think of someone like Slash or like someone doing a guitar solo. It often goes higher and higher as it goes, right? They go really up and they make the face. Whereas this gets lower and lower to the point that as an amateur guitarist, I know my guitar does not go anywhere near this low. How is this guitar going so low? And so, the Tom Waits newsletter is much less interviews. It's more just about the songs. But in this case, first I looked up who the guitarist was. I figured it was Mark Ribot, who's a very experimental guitarist who plays with Tom a lot. It was not. It's a guy named Joe Gore, who I'd never heard of, but he had a website. So I emailed him, and I just literally, talk about a nerdy question. I just said, this one guitar solo you played on this Tom Waits track in the 90s, like, how did you get it to sound like that? And it turned out to be this, just, if you're a nerd like me, a really interesting story about, it was a very specific guitar from the 60s. He tuned both the bottom two strings very low to start, so he was already hitting lower notes. But then as he was playing, he was tuning the E string even lower, to the point that he says you can hear it's buzzing like crazy on the fretboard because it's just loose and flapping around. So he's playing this solo that gets looser and looser. It's not taught at all at this point, but that's how he got that amazing weird guitar solo on this Tom Waits song. And of course, that's such a Tom Waits. Tom Waits is not a guitar solo guy, but that's such a Tom Waits sort of thing to do. He's always taking a 2x4 and bashing on a dumpster to get the percussion sound he wants or something like that. So I just found that just learning that about one of my favorite songs and one of my favorite guitar solos I found fascinating.
Tom Waits loved that when he heard it.
I'm sure that's exactly what he wanted. He doesn't want Slash, no offense to Slash, but he doesn't want that sort of, he doesn't want a slick, session guy who knows all the right things to hit. He wants someone who's just going to tune his guitar way lower than it should go, so it kind of sounds like garbage, and just try to make it work. All right, well, here's one, and this is an interesting example, because this is a Tom Waits song I barely knew. It was a song called Depot Depot, one of his early songs. I've heard all his records. I'm sure I heard it at some point, but I didn't remember it. I still don't think it's not some secret masterpiece, though it is pretty good. But I got more into it after having, sort of glazed over it every time I listened to the album, because there are better songs on the album, researching the story behind it. And Depot Depot is about a specific bus terminal, a specific depot in LA. And it's kind of, this is early days Tom, when he's like living at the Tropicana and just, this sort of drunk beatnik jazzbo guy smoking 10 packs of cigarettes a day and, not quite homeless, but practically. And so he's like spending all this time hanging out at this bus depot on Skid Row in LA. And so you read the story, and I found, old postcard pictures that had this best bus depot on it from back in the day. And it's just like this really divey part of town. And so you hear a story like that, and then you go back and listen to the lyrics and listen to the song. And again, it's not that it somehow makes it one of his all-time classics. I don't think it is. But that experience gets you to understand and just hear a song in a different way that you've skipped over or just ignored your entire time. So something like that I find really memorable. There are other ones where I talk about a song I love, and I talk about how much I love it, and I maybe have a personal story connected to it, and I already know it. I already know what the story behind it is, and so I tell that. But to some degree, the most fun ones are when the song, I'm going alphabetical, and the song comes along. It's like, what is that one again? that name rings a bell, but I don't really remember that one. Those sometimes are the most fun ones to write for me. Tom Waits is a guy I actually got into through Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan used to host a radio show on XM Radio called Theme Time Radio Hour. And when I was in college, this is in the mid 2000s, I was just like in my first wave of being a big Dylan fan. And I remember some people had told me, oh, if you like Dylan, you should like Tom Waits. So I downloaded a Rain Dogs Tom Waits album off of the campus file share server, because that was, off of the T1 line. This is the window we're talking about. So I downloaded my, 64 kbps MP3s of Rain Dogs. And I listen, I make it a song and a half in. I listen to Singapore, I make it halfway through, clap hands, and then I say, nope. Too weird. This guy sounds terrible. Not for me. A year or so goes by, and then I'm listening to this Dylan radio show I mentioned, Theme Time Radio Hour, and he did every week he would do songs on a theme. He would do songs about summer or songs about, I don't know, shoes, whatever. One week, I think the theme was money or something related to money. And he played a Tom Waits song called On the Nickel. And On the Nickel is from an earlier period of Tom Waits where it's jazzier. His voice, while it's not Frank Sinatra, it's a little less idiosyncratic. It's less gruff. He's a little bit of a smoother singer. And it just floored me. On the Nickel floored me. And so I subsequently gave Waits another chance. I started with those slightly more accessible early albums, eventually made it back to Rain Dogs, which now is like one of my favorite albums ever. And I became a huge fan of his. I had so much fun doing the Dylan newsletter that maybe 2 years into it, I decided to start another one just as sort of a real side project. It's nowhere near as regular. It's just sort of on a whim when I feel like it. But going through every single song of the Tom Waits catalog, one by one. And I was going to do it, first I was going to do it chronologically, which in some ways makes the most sense. But because Tom Waits has had these different phases, the jazz bow phase early on, and then the rough and rowdy and just crazy phase later, I really wanted to get to that rough and rowdy crazy phase. And if I did literally every song chronologically, it would be like 5 years before I got to some of my favorite records. So I'm doing them alphabetically, which allows me to, one year it's some jazz beatnik song from the 70s. Another year it's him, or another week it's him, hammering on a dumpster with a 2x4 while shouting blues lyrics in the 2000s. So yeah, it's been great. I mean, the Dylan thing, in a way, one thing that connects them just beyond the music is in both cases, I sort of started them during periods where I hadn't been as plugged into these artists. Dylan, I'd been a super fan following closely, but I was listening to other things. I just sort of had fallen off, and it was early on the pandemic. I was like, man, I remember when I was listening to Dylan bootlegs all the time, and like that was kind of fun, and I was in the fan world and I knew people, and I kind of fell out of that. So I started it just purely selfishly as an excuse to listen to more bootlegs. And the same thing sort of happened with Tom Waits. I'm just listening to new records all the time. Tom Waits is not active. He hasn't released a new record in years. So I said, it's sort of an excuse to listen to more Tom Waits. And it's worked out. Bob Dylan works really well for this book. And I think you're right that Tom Waits would work the same way in that there are great stories about them, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, because they're enigmatic, they're weird, they're unexpected, they do strange things. Like a more sort of straightforward musician, I don't know, Paul McCartney or something, who's just a genius, but he's not doing like weird, wild, crazy stuff and no one understands what the hell he's doing, and he's playing songs they've never rehearsed, and he's not giving the musicians instructions. No, I mean, most people are more, you might even say, professional. But in some ways, the fact that these people, I think definitely Bob Dylan and probably Tom Waits too, are like less professional, less polished, less straightforward with the people they play with, does make them good candidates. People have suggested Neil Young too as a potential interesting person to get stories like this. And I think those sort of people do tend to have the best stories from the musicians they've worked with.